the webinar is not originating on the A&M campus, but is coming out of the Corpus Christi Center down on the coast where the front line of the cold front has not hit yet. So, Pete, we want you to be prepared for high wind. It's what we had at 7 o'clock in College Station this morning, and a lot of rain. So I want to welcome each of you to the webinar. It has, in the last 8 years of working with the webinar series, I've had the pleasure to talk about the largest and the second largest and the third, fourth, fifth, and seventh largest plant families that occur naturally and with introduced species in the state of Texas. So today we're going to be talking about mustards, and they really have a history in the world and life of humans, with records reaching back of using some mustards to make oils all the way back 4,000 years ago. And then looking at and that was in India, and then looking at the Chinese and Japanese using mustard seed oils 2,000 years ago, and then in other parts of Europe starting in about the 13th century. Well, as a range specialist, and dealing with our grasslands, our short, mid, and tall grasslands, and then looking at our desert lands, our tundra, and all the way down to the coastal prairie, how many mustards are of great value in a rangeland situation. Rangeland making up originally in 1836 about 90.7% of the state of Texas. What we find is the scenario that we encountered at the time of settlement, with Europeans coming to Texas in 1823 and up to really into about the 1885 period. Mustards have become more prominent and have become more like a wildflower, but many of the mustards that we're going to talk about today have become a weed. And I would suspect that as we go through this, and I'm going to give you some history and talk about the mustard family, many of you may have tuned in today to find or hear about a solution for some of the mustards that are now heavily infesting our roadsides, our disturbed areas, and even our parks, our gardens, and our lawns. But don't get your hopes up too high, is that if I tell a few jokes, they're not going to lead to a total satisfaction of knowing what to do about things that we don't want that now occur in our natural environment and our man-made environment that we have. I'm very pleased that 43 of you have signed in to talk and hear about mustards. The largest group that has affected man worldwide is the Brassica group, mustards that have been useful for making oil from the seeds. But all of you already know mustards. And so look at this picture, challenge yourself with what food items that we have eaten, and in that long list, there's going to be one that we're going to test you over that really is not a mustard, but it's in a totally different family. But look at the picture here with collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, spinach, and if you look at the list at the bottom, we add broccoli and cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, radishes, cabbage, and then the production of mustard oil, canola, and rapeseed. So when we look at the canola oil, there are 3 different mustards that have been used in the world to make the canola oil, and this is from the Canola Council of America. But the Brassica napus, the Brassica rapa, the Brassica juncea, And so those three have made up the oil. None of those are native to the Western Hemisphere. And so there are many things that we use, but remember, early people that moved to this hemisphere brought their food plants with them. So that today we see that most of the grains we eat, excluding corn, from oats and wheat and barley and rye, these are all from Europe and Western Asia. And so think about how we live and what we do with our landscapes and how we have pretty much set ourselves up to have a mustard problem. So if you go to buy mustard, you can actually buy whole mustard seed, and the seed are pictured here in this right side of the drawing. Look how small they are, and realize that like many weeds, a single mustard plant can produce a lot of seed, and that seed production is what has been important in the oil industry like canola. But down at the bottom, the Sinapis genus is also used to make mustard, besides the two members of the Brassica genus. So we see things around us, and often we don't relate to what we're using in our food to what we're seeing on the land. Here is a backyard garden, and look what's growing in it. And it is a mustard, but it is a mustard that we eat. And this one happens to be turnips, or a variety that's for sale called purple top. And look at the plants. It's a cool season plant. It is an annual plant, with some of our mustards being biennials and some of them being perennials. Most of the time, the mustards are herbaceous plants, with a few in the perennial group being shrubby-like. So this family doesn't have any trees in it that we deal with here, are great big woody plants. So with 154 families noted to occur naturally in the state of Texas, the mustards turn out to be the sixth largest family. So look at the turnip leaves. As I look at the surface of the leaf, I'm going to find that even on turnips, we have hair, we have bristly hairs, we have glands, and that oftentimes people can have a digestive problem from getting too much fiber, and it can upset their digestive tract. So Utah State University research in 1995 released a report that across the world, all known plants are poisonous. Poisonous to something. Because we have to realize that to survive, plants have to have characteristics to keep from being killed, to keep from being eaten, or, in reverse, to attract pollinators for the reproduction of seed and the distribution of propagules for the success and future life of a plant. So the turnips, you know, I grew up in a family at San Angelo, and we ate all of them. My grandparents all grew turnips and collards and mustards and other plants. But notice in Europe, we have records from Europe to China to India that these plants have been used by humans for more than 4,000 years. In the Master Gardener and the Howdy Garden here at A&M, the tallest yellow plant here in the center of the picture, this plant is broccoli. And notice that when we go to eat broccoli, we're pulling out a stem with congested flowers. But if I don't harvest the plant readily and keep it in a vegetative state and going to reproduction, then the plant will get taller and have many stems and get like this one right here. So this group, Brassica oleracea, is an important food group because there are more plants that we eat that come out of this genus Brassica and the Oleracea that are on the market shelf today. Looking at this picture here, in the original taxonomy of these mustards, they were put into a group called the cruciferae, and the cruciferous are cross-like pattern that the four petals of the flower make gave rise to the name of the family. Working in taxonomy and plant naming, ultimately most of the members of the cruciferae have been put into a new family name called the Brassicaceae, but all of them have this typical flower that's going to have four petals and that it forms like a cross that you see in this picture. The fruit in the mustard family is called the Sleek. So we don't have acorns here, uh, or like the grass seed, the caryopsis with glooms, but we do have, as I'm showing you with the green arrow, coming off of this pedestal where the flower appeared, there is the fruit, a Sleek, and inside that fruit are the seed in a long single row. Some of these mustards can have 1 to 2 seed. Some can have up to 60 to 90 seed, depending upon what mustard species I'm looking at. And again, the picture here is of broccoli. So some like Brassica caber that I can now find growing on the side of the road, we have two kinds of leaves on these mustards. We have basal leaves that are much bigger than the one I'm circling here, but this is a leaf that without a petiole, it is a clasping leaf around the stem. And the leaves on the flowering stems are most of the time much smaller than the leaves that we have at the base of the plant. So leaves are highly variable even within the same species of mustard. So I have a test question for you at this point. Notice in the question that Pete and I are providing you today, broccoli is in the Italica cultivar group for Brassica oleracea. Well, which of these that I've listed, all are food items, which ones of these are in a group that would be in the Brassica cultivar group? If you'll put a check in every one of them, or if you don't think any of them are in the Brassica or any of the groups related to broccoli, leave it blank. And Pete will look and see how they answer, because the subject is cabbage, cauliflower, kale, collard greens, and Brussels sprouts. And I wanted to eat a healthy diet, and I've just about had all the kale that I can take. So I'm looking at alternatives here today.
Yeah. I think I messed up the poll question because you can only select one.
You can only select one.
Yes.
Okay, well,
So
that'll
it's my
let
fault.
me tell a little story. Well, give you just a few more seconds to put your answer in. Pete, I think we've got to the answer. And I'll go to the next slide and explain it. That if you had had the ability to mark all five of those plants, you would have been absolutely correct, because all five of those food plants that we eat are in cultivar groups of Brassica oleracea. But if you marked any of them, then you did realize that they were a mustard. So this, their mustards are around us, but oftentimes we don't identify what they are. because of the plant part that we're eating. Not everything's going to look like a turnip green. And so think about the cabbage that we eat. It is in this group, and late in the season when it goes to flower, you would find the four-petaled, cross-shaped flower. We'll go to this sheet here that comes out of a taxonomy book by Radford, looking at plant parts, and even the phenology of the major families of plants that we have in the United States. So the mustard family is a large family worldwide. It has 365 genera and 3,250 species. Some of the genera only have one species in them because notice 3,250 divided by 365 would be less than 10 species per genus. As I look at the chart here, in the center and where I have my green arrow going, notice the basal leaves, and oftentimes we call these rosette leaves. And so most of the mustards have this kind of growth form. And when we think about uh, things that we eat from this family, this is a very important part of the plant because it is the leaf that we're consuming, or even in cases feeding the livestock. As I go up the stem from these highly dissected leaves of variable shapes and lobing, and I get up on the stem leaves, I see that they have a more simple type leaf when I get on the reproductive stem. And in this case, the plant we're looking at is a line drawing of shepherd's purse, Capsella bursa Pasteuris, and it has a unique fruit. It's flowering right now. Many of the plants flowered prior to December that came up with the abundant fall rain that we got after 8 to 10 months worth of drought. But notice there there is a seed on each side of this upside down triangle that looks kind of like a heart in this shape. And so it has a few seed where when I go over here to this Sleek, and even the triangle is still classified as a Sleek, but I look at this long one on the far right from another genera and another species. Think about how many seed can be in there. And this abundance of seed production relates to an annual weed strategy that for weeds to survive the disturbances of the earth, the disturbances of humans, and changing climate over long periods of time, seed production is very important because for an annual plant, the only way you're going to come back and be around in the future is to come back from seed, which makes many of these plants different than the perennials that we're used to on rangeland. When I go to the left top and I look at the flower, notice that there are four petals. The petals can be white or yellow, and some are tinted pink and even with a little purple. But notice inside that floral arrangement that I have one, two, three, four, five, six stamen that are producing the pollen, and then a single stigma in the center of that flower. Underneath the petals are the perianth, down here are the sepals, and if I look at the cup that's holding the flower together, it is an arrangement of four sepals. So I have four sepals, four petals, and I have six stamen. The key about the stamen is they're in two different rows, and they can either be two stamen in one row and four in the other, or four stamen on the inner row and two on the outer row. But I always, within the family, uh, with only a few exceptions, I have six stamen. So these are characteristics that I'm looking at the leaves, I'm looking at the flowering stem, and many mustards have only one stem. I'm looking at the kind of fruit, the Sleek that's representative of this family, knowing that it can be of various shapes, and I'm looking at my flower arrangement. When I look at taxonomy, the science of naming, most of our science of naming is done off of the flower and what's down in the ovary. It's not done from the color of the plant, the size of the plant, or even the shape of the leaves, because drought can make a plant bigger or smaller. Above normal rainfall can make a plant bigger or smaller. But through time, it is the floral arrangement of the petals, the sepals, and the stamen and the stigma down to the ovaries where the eggs are that lead us into interpreting and coming up with a name and comparing across other noted species that are similar. Look down at the very bottom, and you can see that in the Lobularia genus, we can have a flat pod, and in the Coronopus, we can have a dissected pod. One one thing that happens is in the Sleek actually at these edges breaks into two halves uh, with a third section on the inside. Now, the arrangement of these is quite variable. If I look over here at Scimbrium officinale, I can see that these Sleeks are rotating around. They're not really opposite or alternate, they're whirled so that I have one on one side, one on the other, and then one back facing me. They're actually whirled. And so down in these leaves, the leaves, and including the leaves on the stem, in the family, they're generally alternate. So this diagram and this kind of sheet of looking at a family is important, even though it's using several genera and species. Well, the mustard family, the most noted thing is it's economically important, and that many members of the family are herbs and rarely a shrub or a woody plant. The family recognition includes herbs with basal leaves and alternate leaves on reproductive stems. The flowers have four petals in a cruciform or cross arrangement. The flower color is variable, but most often yellow or white, and the fruit is a sleek or a two-valve capsule that will separate into two parts, exposing the seed at the time of ripening. So, the mustard family, sixth largest family of plants in Texas, and with that we have 46 noted genera. That will increase if we bring in other plants from other parts of the world. But within the 46 genera, there's 123 species, and within the 123 species, some of them have noted varieties, like the Brassica oleracea. It has four varieties, and then a lot of subgroups that have been put together through man's selection. So, of the 123 species in Texas, it's important to note that 90 are annuals, with 25 being perennials, and 8 of these are classified as biennials. And when I come down uh, and I look within the 123 species here at the bottom, 105 are labeled as cool season plants, with 18 being warm season plants. So you see in the mustard family that we are dominated by cool season, meaning they come up in the fall, they grow in the winter, they flower in the spring, and if it's of these 90 annuals that we have, then they're going to die at the end of spring. Again, the 18 warm seasons are not all perennials, and note that within the family, that great famous word biennial, that 8 of them of these species are classified as biennials. Biennials typically meaning that the plant comes up from seed one year, it goes through a vegetative growth stage, and the following year the plant goes to flower and produces fruit, and then in that second year the plant dies. Well, in my mind and in dealing with that, the 90 annuals that are cool season, they're actually living across 2 years, but they only live in the fall and in the spring and seldom make it into the summer. So we look at cool season annuals as being the basis of what the group has. The 46 genera. This slide is showing alphabetically the names. The ones that I have underlined, the Brassica, the Camelina, the Descarania, the Lescarella, the Roripa, and then looking at this next slide, here's what a Lescarella looks like. And in this case, notice the four petals and the crucifix type shape, and you really can't see much of the fruit in the picture, but the ultimate fruit is an inflated round circular sleek that actually holds air, and if when I squeeze it, I can pop the air out. And this is a picture of the species Findleri that occurs in central to west Texas, but it was suspected back in the 1970s to be a toxic plant that caused hard yellow liver disease in white-tailed deer, but it was never proven through science. The remaining genera, starting here in the S's and going down to Philosophy, look at those. The Scimbrium here is a major plant in the state, but notice as I go across over here, the on the right side, the Arabis only has 3 species, and several genera do. In the Brassica, we have 4 species. The cardamine, we have 6 species. Descarania, we have 3 species. Draba, we have 5 species. But interesting about the Draba group, they're all native, where all these other genera, except for a few, we have both introduced and native plants. The lepidium, the pepper weeds, the pepper grass, the pepper seed, uh, used by early settlers to crush the little tiny seed because it had the flavor and consistency of black pepper, thus giving its name pepperweed. We have 9 species, and they're all native to the state of Texas, also meaning that they occur in other states or other parts of North America. For Lescarella, we have 19 species, and all of those are native. The Lescarella, some of them are annuals, some of them are perennials. Up here within Draba, in these 5 species, most are perennials. When I get to more of an aquatic environment, we have the genus Roripa. We have 9 species, they're all native. And so notice that our largest genera that are in the state of Texas, these are the ones that have the most species in them. The other genera have only 1 to 3 species and are very small groupings in the state of Texas. And some of them are monotypic, they only have 1 species in the whole genus. Looking at the Brassicaceae or mustard family, a total of 33 of the species are introduced. They're introduced from other parts of the world, and typically these are from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Uh, Many of the introduced are annuals, such as the bastard cabbage, the Rapistrum rugosum, which all of our master naturalists in the Lost Pines chapter, they're very aware of that because in this era where we've been receiving rain uh, every all through the year and above normal rainfall, the bastard cabbage, or in some books called ball mustard, it's blooming every single day of the year. It's well adapted to the climate that we have, and it's a prolific seed producer. Well, 30 of the introduced species are annuals, with only 3 of the introduced classified as perennials. And so, if I'm going out to manage unwanted plants, it's very valuable to me to know if a plant is an annual or if the plant is a perennial, because typically in a control strategy for annuals, if I kill the top of the plant or mow it straight down to the surface of the soil, the annuals have no basal buds for regenerating the plant. Where in a perennial plant, a lot of times the root system at the crown and down into the ground, it has buds for sending up new stems. So in our case, how we treat the plant determines what it's going to be doing in our environment. And I'll get to that a little bit more here as we go along. From one of the British books that is in my library, look at this drawing, characteristic of the Brassicaceae. And notice this bee, the leaf is going to be highly variable. And in this case, it looks more like a turnip green or a member of the genus Brassica. Again, the flowers uh, appear in C. You got the four petals, and a lot of times these are grouped in a raceme so that the fruit ultimately come out in a fruit arrangement called a raceme. And the varying number of Sleeks that I have is dependent on what genus I'm looking at. But notice in G, this is the splitting of the Sleek into two parts and exposing in the middle the transverse partition. And so the two halves are separated, and the seed are not actually attached to the outside of the Sleek, but they're attached to the center part on this transverse partition. So all of our Sleeks have some mechanism for breaking open like this to disperse the seeds into the environment. The B again is more of a basal leaf type, and if I look at A down here at the bottom, I can see the more simple, unlobed, undissected leaf of what's going to be on a reproductive stem. So here we're looking at reproduction, and if I'm controlling an annual plant and I don't want my soil seed bank to increase in this plant, my method of control and my management decisions would lead to keep flowering production at a minimum and not let any of the seed pods, the Sleek, go and produce ripened seed. Well, what's wrong with that? When you're mowing your lawn, when do you mow? You mow when the grass is at an appropriate height, whether you're using a tiff grass, a zoysia grass, a Bermuda grass, or St. Augustine. You have a selected height that you're going to mow. And a lot of lawn mowers come with a 1 inch off of the surface blade, which actually leaves enough of the plant intact to come back and not be killed, even though it may be an annual, not be killed by a riding or push type mower. So think about what we do. Also in Texas, Mrs. Poole with Texas Parks and Wildlife, she wrote a book on the rare plants of Texas back in the late 1990s. And so there are 10 species, and I'm not going to read out everything about it, but I want you to see here the Texas bittercress, that a rare plant. It is an annual, and it's a warm season plant, and it grows on the western edge of the Edwards Plateau in Kinney and Uvalde counties, west to the Trans-Pecos and Brewster and Jeff Davis. Well, you're in the more arid part of the country, so you might think that this plant is going to grow in rocks or going to grow in shaded areas, which it does, so that the water that's received in a low rainfall area of the state hangs around longer. Now, look at number 2, Leavenworthia, the Texas Golden Glade Cress. It's an annual, but it's a cool season. And notice that out of the 373 plants that are endemic to Texas, meaning they only occur in the state of Texas. This Leavenworthia texana is one of those, and it only occurs in Sabine and San Augustine counties over in East Texas next to the Louisiana border. So in Louisiana, the plant is more abundant, but the conditions for that plant to survive in Texas are only found in these two counties. Phaceria pallida, number three, the white bladder pod, it's endemic to East Texas and it only occurs along the Louisiana border in San Augustine County. Number four and five are in the same genus, Phaceria, and look at this one that occurs in South Texas. It occurs only in Zapata and Starr County, probably showing that it's going to be a high sand type loving plant and prefer sandy soils like on the edges of the sand plain that occur down in deep South Texas. The Phaceria valida, uh, also known as the strong bladder pod, the scaly bladder pod. Again, it occurs out in Culberson and Hudspeth counties. Typically, the plants that we see that are rare, they have a highly restricted environment that they're going to occur in. So if I if I look at this image here, here is an introduced plant that is for sale, and it looks very similar to our five species of Roripa. And notice again the four white flowers telling me that it's in the mustard group, but this is the watercress that we can buy locally at a grocery store and use it in salads and garnish within our food and other things that we do with our plant material. But our five species that we have that are native, they live in the spring water or in low-lying water where the plants can emerge and be rooted but get above the surface of the water. So the Roripa nasturtium in many of our hill country streams, you can find this introduced plant that we eat. You can find it growing there because people have planted it. The Roripa ramosa, Durango yellowcress, canyon watercress. It's a perennial. A cool season occurs in West Texas and Brewster and Terrell counties of the Trans-Pecos. Here we have the bracted twisted flower, bracted jewel flower, an annual, and again it's endemic to the Edwards Plateau and is found in Bexar, Comal, Medina, and Real counties, where a large number of our 373 endemic plants are growing in these four counties, plus Hayes County and sometimes Kerr and Gillespie counties, all over an isolated area. You think about Algerita, uh, the Texas barberry. The Texas barberry, Mahonia texana, it only occurs in these counties. It's restricted to an environment of growing on limestone. Our plant number 8, Cutler's jewel flower, an annual, grows only in the fall, winter, and spring. It occurs in West Texas only in one county, Brewster County. The next one in the same genus, the sparsely flowered jewel flower, again an annual, a cool season, and we only find it in Texas and Culberson County, but it also occurs in Coahuila, Chihuahua, and one other state in Mexico below the Culberson County area. The number 10 plant, Schinner's rocket, and rocket is an interesting word that's used within the Brassica family to describe some plants, but notice it's the Rio Grande tumble mustard, and again it is an annual cool season, and it occurs only down at our lowest county in the state of Texas, Cameron County, where we find Brownsville and a growing metroplex area that ultimately could threaten the Rio Grande tumble mustard just based on what humans do in bringing about businesses and the civilization that man creates. So, members of this family, uh, one of the reviewers, as I was preparing for the talk, said, "Well, don't the mustards contain chemicals and oils that can harm people and harm animals?" And on rangeland, yes, we do have one native plant that's containing a glucoside called Tansy mustard, Descarania pinnata. It is native in the state of Texas. It's a cool season mustard found in all regions of Texas except the Piney Woods Region 1, Ecoregion 1 of East Texas. It is usually a single stemmed plant, and it is toxic to cattle, the only livestock that we have reports of poisoning, and the cattle have to eat it in large amounts. Well, what do cattle typically eat? They eat grass. So sometimes if I'm getting short of grass, I'm in a drought, or under poor management, the landowner runs out of grass. Cattle don't just sit there and starve to death. They start eating the rest of the plants that man provides before them in that complex. So the tansy mustard is pictured here, and notice the fruit, the sleek, and the four petaled flower, and in this case it's yellow, but sometimes in the population, like we see genetic variation, the petals of the flower can actually be white. And down in the bottom uh, left, look at the highly dissected leaf that we have for this member of the Descarania, and the bottom right picture shows you a fairly dense stand of a whole bunch of single stem plants there for the tansy mustard. But in range management and livestock management, this is one that we think about uh, having too much of it, and it could cause a problem. Now remember, on the opening slide about the family, I showed you a can of leafy spinach, Spinacia oleracea, that is native to Central and Western Asia. Do we eat the green leaves, but do you really think this plant is a member of the mustard family? Please mark yes or no for this question. And Pete has put the chart up, and Pete, we're running 50-50, and so mark one of those. Uh, and I've noted that 48 of you are still watching it, so we're looking for 48 answers. And we look at that far right of the screen that Pete has, and we see how many people have voted. So, Pete, it's almost equal. A few more that say yes, and a few less that say no. So I think with that right there, Pete, if we would end the poll, I'm going to tell you that the spinach you see here in the middle of the frame, this is actually in the Chinopodiaceae, and up in the writing up here I put Amaranthaceae, but that is incorrect. So when I think about plants like lamb's quarter, another Chinopod, spinach is actually in that family, the Chinopodaceae. And so even though we're eating the leaves, it is not a member of the mustard family. So think about what we do as humans. Why would we be driving a weed system in life today? And so land in Texas was most commonly used for farming and livestock agriculture, and now the metroplex and urbanization is on the increase. But in this farming example, this was an old cotton field, and if I look at the back, when the cotton field was released from farming after 100 years, a grass like Bermuda grass was planted. The landowner on this bare spot at the bottom of the picture, he fed hay, and he fed round bales, and he came back and fed here for about 10 years every winter, And when the hay decomposed on the surface, it left a highly rich, uncovered soil. And what comes up on bare ground? We get an assundry of weeds. So when I look at the picture here, a lot of these weeds that I see are annual Palmer amaranth or Palmer's pigweed. Over here, I see the annual cocklebur on the left, and on the right, this yellow flowering nightshade is buffalo burr Solanum rostratum. This is the kind of environment that is conducive to perpetuating a cool season annual mustard problem on the lands that we have. That if we uncover the land and you think about the distribution of seed and think about that roadside environment where the bastard cabbage occurs, we continually, through mowing, through driving, through wildfires set by cigarettes, we continually open up that land on the roadside. That makes it a very conducive site, being always disturbed, that mustard seeds would come up here, especially the cool season annuals. But likewise, let's think about what we do on our ranching land, and even in this slide of a working pen setup over in Robertson County, the cows disturb it because we bring in a lot of animals. They churn the soil up. And so this is camphor weed, a heterotheca in the sunflower family. But the thing that we're trying to do is keep the land covered with the thing that was on most of our rangeland originally, and that is grass. The better I manage grass and provide a cover throughout the year, the fewer annual plants that come up. But we do have mechanisms for controlling weeds. But the thing about many of our weeds, if you think about broomweed, common or annual broomweed, Texas Tech University research by Ron Sosebee shows that the seed are viable in the soil for a minimum of 19 years. So I could go in here and kill the weeds, but if I return to my previous management of disturbance, then the seed of that weed are in the soil. They're already in the soil seed bank, and I'm going to have that problem plant return in the open, bare soil areas. If it's a warm season annual, they're going to germinate in the spring. If it's a cool season annual, they're going to germinate in September, October, November to early December. So we run a disturbance system. And here's that picture of the bastard cabbage on the roadside. But think about the continual disturbance that we're doing in the bar ditch and in the edge of the gravel or the caliche on the roadside all the way to the fence line. The one thing that has helped is we have a policy today because of wildflowers and beautifying Texas that only one swath of the roadside mower goes down the road, or we have the mow now policy if we're not interested in wildflowers. But this is right here in College Station, and I took this picture day before yesterday. It's a warm winter. We've only gotten down to 28 degrees. This plant germinated back in the fall, and look how big it's gotten with above normal rainfall that we have. Many of the Rapistrum rugosum, they are single stem plants, where I showed you a multi-stem plant. Again, the same kind of flower, but notice on this genus Rapistrum, the Sleek is a two-chambered, two-seeded. But think about the number of seed that every individual bastard cabbage is producing. If our mowing policy does not control the plant through mowing and keep it going from flower, because who's mowing in the wintertime? Who's mowing in the early spring? And on many roadsides, we're waiting to the end of May to mow. That is conducive to the further production and storage of seed of this plant in the soil. So even when I go out as a volunteer and I'm pulling this plant up on the roadside, if the disturbance returns, that opens the soil surface up and I get the plants back through germination. So as I look at the bastard cabbage, the basal leaves are noted to be down here in the bottom right. They're going to be lobed. They're going to be crenate or serrate. But when I look at the stem leaf, uh, they still have the serrations, but the lobing and the leaf are smaller and the dentate is much smaller. But this is a plant of a disturbed environment. And in 1985, coming out of a drought, uh, bastard cabbage came up all up and down the Brazos River from College Station all the way to Waco. So it is a plant that's been here for quite a while, but it's getting a very strong hold on the roadside environment. Now, this next picture is showing you a planted wheat field, and the wheat field here is used for a highly nutritious wintertime grazing for livestock. But look at the winter, look at the field cabbage that has come in, Brassica rapa. And so what does a man do about this? Is there a chemical that I can spray or a pre-emerged chemical available in an environment called a plowed field that I could keep this plant from coming up? Do the livestock in there eat the plant? Apparently, since they're already in there grazing, we see that this one is not being consumed. But in other fields, in winter oats, we're finding charlock or the field mustard, as you see in the rosette here. And again, with warm weather, these kind of plants are going to go to flower and set seed, and their vegetation is going to cover the bare soil. But when these annuals die and blow away, they leave the bare soil open once again for the return of the invasion. If I move to a lawn environment, and this picture is from December the 19th in San Angelo, Texas, notice that we're looking at Scimbrium Erio. Uh, I've got a whole plant right here. I've got a plant here and plants all the way back. It is typically a single stem plant in the beginning of its flowering and then goes to multi-stem. But this plant from Europe is called London Rocket or Rocket Mustard. And if I look at the Sleek in this next picture, notice on this Sleek right here, I counted 42 seed in there. Look at the number of Sleeks that are coming out of that mustard flower arrangement, and that it started flowering here at the base, and then like a bluebonnet, it flowers all the way to the top, and if moisture is available, it keeps producing buds to continue the flowering as long as moisture is available. So with the mustard family, we really have a significant problem, but it's in disturbed environments out on rangeland that is well managed and kept covered with grass, using the tools of management, using our fire, using chemicals, using proper stocking rate and timing of when we're going to be eating the grass. Many of these plants, like this rocket mustard, will not invade that site. Again, well managed native grass rangeland. So on the London rocket, here's what the plant looked like in September, October, and November after the rains around San Angelo began about the second week of September. So it looks like a turnip, but look at the opposite lobing of this dissected leaf. So many times, and then down here, they're not exactly opposite. High variability in the lobing and what we're going to see in the structure of the leaves. So it is not always enough information from the basal rosette leaves to identify every mustard that we have. Often we have to wait till they go to flower. And then the one that I had at the opening, this is what on December the 19th, the Capsella versa Pasteuris look like the shepherd's purse, also a foreign introduced plant. And you see in this picture that the Sleek is an upside down triangle, but it's still divided into two parts. And the flowers can be yellow or they can be white. And sometimes I've found them with tints of good. Well, our last example is a native mustard. Here is Dracaena Bacunifolia. This native cool season annual is commonly named whitlow-wort or wedge-leaf draba, and it loves sandy and gravelly soils, and it occurs almost throughout the state of Texas. You find a lot of it right now on bare ground, on limestone in the hill country. And I noticed last week that many of them have not gone to flower, but the typical flowering period would be in the month of March, at least uh, beginning in late February. And this is the Sleek of the genus Draba, and these have a sticky hair on them on the stems supporting the flowers, the flowering stem. There's a sticky hair there, and then the pod, the Sleek itself, has a hair on it. And again, hair is often a valuable tool when I'm trying not only to separate species, but sometimes the hair is in the key for even separating the genus. And so, ladies and gentlemen, those are the native, we have native members of the family, but notice the ones that we are worried about the most in our environment are the introduced cool season mustards that we see so abundantly in disturbed areas. The tools of agriculture management are not going to solve that problem. Now working with a new entity of managers that manage roadsides, vacant lots, the interstate system, think about what it is that we need to be doing. It all begins with understanding the biology and even the phenology of the plant of interest. I hope you've got something out of this introduction to the mustard family and from an ecological standpoint, what we're looking at to try to get a control on some of these mustards. Now, Pete, have we had any questions that have come in? And I see Kathy Cox is typing a question right now.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes, and Pete and I will stay on the line to answer questions.
No questions
Pete,
so far. Yes, sir. There's one. Uh, Kathy asked, Sleek is a new term to me. Can you explain more about Sleeks?
yeah, the Sleek is very similar to a term that we call the follicle. The Sleek means that it has that transverse, uh, thin, see-through layer in the middle, and that there are two opposite sides that are holding the seed, and the seeds are attached to the inside and not to the shell of the seed pod. Some people would call it a capsule, but notice in the family the Sleek can be round and two-seeded up to the two-seeded upside down triangle, or even to uh, the long Sleek that contain 100 or more seeds in it. But that's a good question.
Yes, sir. We have another question from SARA Restoration. Do you have managed do you have managed recommendations for landowners to break the cycle between cool season condensation and reseeding, mowing, herbicide, or something else?
A management recommendation. Um, Typically, what you're looking at is the disturbance that your management is causing. What time of year? So let's think about doing a prescribed burn. And my fire, I'm doing it in February. Cool season annuals would be consumed by the fire, but seed in the soil would still be viable. Typically, a prescribed burn moving across a grass pasture at 5 miles per hour will heat the soil up about 1 degree Fahrenheit, not killing anything in the soil. But what you do is you burn up the carbon structure of plants that are above the soil. So if that plant that you wanted to kill, if it's still within its germination period, even after a prescribed burn, uh, plants will come back from seed. But typically, wintertime prescribed fire is a disturbance and it opens it up to bare ground. And note that I'll kill the cool season annuals, but now I'll build a bare ground environment for warm season annuals and perennials to germinate. So it's kind of a catch-22 when we recognize that the natural fires of Texas prior to European settlement occurred predominantly in the months of August and September on the driest, hottest days, and typically in drought-like conditions where lightning bolts from a convection storm or thunderstorm hit the ground and lit the dry grass on fire. So what we saw before settlement is different than what we see today, and because of liability and having to have good soil moisture as one of the recommendations to do a prescribed fire, most of our fires are being conducted in the wintertime to the early spring. Restoration fires, knocking everything down, would be conducted in July, August, and early September. Note that if you're planting a warm season perennial grass, that you're going to go out and plow in September, and you're going to let the natural rainfall settle your soil. The mistake that is made is people make the decision to go do plant seeding on our rangelands. They decide to do that in the winter and the spring. So they go out and plow a week before that they're going to seed, because the typical seeding date in central Texas for warm season perennial grasses is March the 15th. Well, they plow right during the beginning of the warm season annual germination period, so that when they go in and plow late and plant in that March period, woolly croton, prairie tea, common broomweed, bitter sneezeweed, they all come up. So if you plow in September, late August and September, and you plant a quick cover crop such as oats and wheat, and with fall rain you get your soil covered, you are actually doing something that will change the surface environment, and you will be able to outcompete fall weeds. And because that oats or wheat will extend into May, you will reduce many of the warm season weeds that are going to come up in March, April, May, and June. Now, realize that the oats and wheat are going to go dead, or we're going to graze them down, and then we're going to use something like no-till drilling to put the seed in, and we're going to reduce the disturbance when I go to plant. So only the drop line where the seed are going is going to be disturbed. And the plant I grew as a cover crop, a cool season grass that doesn't reproduce and become a problem like oats and wheat, that gives me that cover to outcompete sunlight for weeds. Remember, in the original prairie, the people said, well, I've got grass out here on the prairie that's stirrup high or belly high to a horse. We had tall grass. As you drive the state today, are you looking at belly high grass? Because under belly high grass on the soil surface where the weed seed are, that's dark down there. If a seed germinates and it's in the darkness of tall grass, the seedling of that weed dies, even though the temperature and the moisture correct. So sometimes you need to be looking at one of the 5 things that makes plants grow, and that is sunlight to the soil surface. If I can modify that, then I can battle weeds. But yes, we have all kinds of recommendations, and a few of them work. and it often depends on what the landowner can afford to do. Uh, Typically, the mowing is a method to reduce flowering and setting seed to go in the soil seed bank. That makes mowing a valuable tool if I haven't been able to keep my land covered with the grass.
Yeah, we have another question. First, let me answer Daniel's question. Yes, this webinar has been recorded and is relisted on naturalresourcewebinars.tamu.edu. Then again, let me say before I get to the other question is our coming in webinar in March 7th, preparing for brush herbicide treatment. Dr. Bob Lyons, W1 CEU General. Credit to that webinar. Again, a questionnaire survey popped up. Please answer the questionnaire. If by some chance you didn't get the questionnaire, click on that. And with that, let me go back to the question. Charles had a question. Says I gather pulling up bastard cabbage is the best way to control it.
Well, and I thought that's what we were getting our master volunteers to do is work on uh, bastard cabbage in the highly infected areas. But just know you're only controlling the next set of seed to be produced. But if that stand has already been there for 5 to 10 years, if I open the soil surface back up to full sunlight, I'm going to get more. So yes, hand pulling, like most best management practices, is a short-term fix. It's not a long-term fix, but you have to get started somewhere, and you hope when you remove this year's stand that I'm pulling up that I'm going to open it so that grass can grow back. And I don't care right now if it's Johnson grass, King Ranch blue stem, if it's Bahia grass, or Bermuda grass, or native grass. All of those are going to be sufficient in growing back a cover that keeps bastard cabbage from reemerging as a cool season annual.
Yeah, we have a
And I
problem with
appreciate the
tanglehead.
comments from the restoration group that, yeah, uh, it's very hard to come up with a cookbook answer when I'm working to restore a piece of land. Restoration is a management philosophy that takes many years to achieve an input. If I left it up to Mother Nature, many of the problems that we now cause, it would take about 100 years for Mother Nature to fix it if we left and moved to Arizona. So it's not easy. These problems are not easily solved. But through our restoration ecologists and a brand new project over at Memorial Park in Houston on 1,500 acres. We're looking at all kinds of things, not to just to get rid of mustards, but to get rid of warm season perennial introduced grasses that we've brought in as a part of an earlier restoration program to keep the soil covered. Foreign grasses are actually classified as weeds, and on disturbed land, what grows the best? It's weeds. So, weedy species have played an important picture in how we see the land being brought back today, whether it was from farming or other causes of disturbance, including hurricanes, hailstorms, and tornadoes.
Yeah, the SARA says they've been using rogue hose to chop below the soil surface after flowering and prior to seed on that bastard cabbage.